Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jelena, and I'm the co-convener of the Media at Sydney seminar series for this year. So today we have three of our colleagues presenting. They will be talking about smart publics, imaginaries and discoveries of smart street furniture. But before we get started, there's just a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to talk about. So firstly, we welcome cameras on. It's always nice for presenters to be able to see their audience. So do feel free to keep your camera on. If you prefer not, that is fine as well. We are also recording, even though camera's on, it would be appreciated that all mics are mute, otherwise I'll take control and mute you myself. And we are recording today's session to be posted on YouTube and to our blog. So if you would not like to appear on camera and you have your camera on, please send me a private message and I'll do my best to edit you out. So I think that is those are all the main Zoom points. So today we have Justine Humphrey, Chris Cheshire and Sophia Malson. And Justine is a lecturer in digital cultures in our department, MECO. She researches cultures and politics of digital media and emerging technologies with a focus on the social consequences of mobile, smart and data-driven technologies. Chris Cheshire is a senior lecturer in digital cultures in MECO. His research focuses on the medium specificity of digital media, embodied cultures of social robotics and the social construction of the smart city and smart home. Our colleague Sophia Malson is an ARC DECRA Fellow in Architecture, Design and Planning, and she researches practices of hacking housing. Her research is predominantly situated at the intersection of the digital and material. She's interested in the way digital technologies mediate and can reconfigure housing, the urban and everyday. So I will throw it over to Justine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jelena. Please let me know if you're having any trouble hearing me, but otherwise I'll proceed. So first of all, I'd just like to say welcome to this Media at Sydney seminar and thank you very much for joining us this Thursday. I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney stands. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. And as we reflect on the grounds that we occupy this moment, I'm actually on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We might give some thought to the way that the land and the cities that we live in are being shaped by a variety of forces, be it colonialism, urban development, or the restrictions on movement and gathering placed on citizens during COVID-19. Some have even speculated the changes that we're seeing in cities around the world in response to the pandemic may fundamentally change our relationship with public space. So in this presentation today, we'll be talking about the social and spatial transformations at a much smaller scale that come about as a result of the introduction of new kinds of digitally enhanced street furniture in cities, drawing on the results of the recently completed Smart Publics research project, which examined smart kiosks in Glasgow and smart benches in London. I'll be co-presenting with my research collaborators, Chris Cheshire and Sophia Malson. And to begin with, I'll be introducing the project, some details of the research that we conducted, then hand over to my colleague Sophia, who'll discuss the imaginaries that underpinned the furniture design and whether and how these were realised in practice. Her part of the talk connects with emerging ideas of smart citizenship and the way in which these are bound up in the imaginings and uses of specific city infrastructures and personal media. Chris will then present on the discovery processes of street furniture, evaluated through established theories of innovation, adoption, and social construction. We'll then return to me for some final concluding remarks, and I will formally launch the research report and open it up to the audience for questions and discussion. So the Smart Publics project, just to let you know, is a collaboration between two universities, the University of Sydney and the University of Glasgow, with a large multidisciplinary team of researchers. The project was funded by a Partnership Collaboration Award, and it took place between February 2019 and May 2020. I co-led the research with my Glasgow colleague, Professor Bridget Wessels, and my interest in this topic originated in research that I carried out in New York City on Link NYC, which is an implementation of a citywide smart kiosk. And what I was interested in the research at the time was trying to understand how these were being used, who was using them, and what were the digital inclusion outcomes of these Wi-Fi equipped kiosks. The Smart Publics project focused on the introduction and usage of InLink UK kiosks in Glasgow, which were modelled on the Link NYC design, and Strawberry Energy benches in London. And a key aim of the project was to grasp this experience of smart innovation for citizens who encounter new kinds of urban objects in public space, going about their everyday affairs, and to connect the user experience to the design and governance of these emerging forms. The research questions straddle these three dimensions to ask, how do different publics use smart kiosks and benches as they move through a city and stay connected with data and services? What are the challenges in designing inclusive, transparent, and trusted smart street furniture? And how are smart kiosks and benches governed in terms of their appearance, their purpose, their location and maintenance, what data they collect and use, and finally, what their funding and partnership arrangements. So smart street furniture is typically associated with smart cities, a term that we've all heard probably too much about. It has multiple meanings and uses, and just about every journal article on smart cities starts with the fact that it's impossible to define, but it originates in a fairly simple, very technology-centered idea that the real-time data that is generated from urban sensing devices installed throughout the city can be used for improving city services and planning, potentially. Significantly, the discourse of smart cities and actual smart technology implementations emerge in specific political and economic contexts, and oftentimes in cities and countries that are facing acute forms of urban inequality and distress. The United Kingdom is a case in point, where there is a confluence of trends that have driven up housing and work insecurity and the digital requirements for participating socially and economically. These trends of high rates of homelessness, the rise of digital welfare, and insecure housing and work form the backdrop of smart urban innovation and the appearance of new kinds of smart street furniture in public space. Indeed, many of the cities that face acute forms of urban distress embrace visions of the smart city and the digital strategies that underpin these to respond to these challenges. Glasgow City Council was one of the Scottish cities that commissioned the Smart Cities Scotland Blueprint, with objectives to improve lives, enhance collaboration and engagement, open data and transparency, technology and innovation, and environmental sustainability. In 2018, the Council announced the Digital Glasgow Strategy, which acknowledged the introduction of the InLinks. It placed the digital at the centre of public policy, celebrating existing strengths in IT, aiming to address barriers to digital inclusion, and aspiring to introduce smart public services. London has a long history of innovation and investing in infrastructures and smart cities. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has set out a roadmap to make London the smartest city in the world, in which he explains the vision of treating data as infrastructure as important as roads, railways, and energy networks. Meanwhile, London boroughs have developed their own smart and digital strategies. So Southwark Council has developed a digital strategy that emphasises digital inclusion, access to infrastructure and reduced costs. The Council's infrastructure strategy 2017 to 2020 commits to engaging in targeted commercial partnerships to increase Wi-Fi provision, and to do so by supporting the innovative use of street assets, including smart benches, billboards, and local schemes. In the context of austerity and the impact it's had on local government, private sector partnerships are not only seen as an effective way to reduce costs, but also to support innovation and test bedding. So this was the case for Southwark Council in their support for Strawberry Energy, a relatively small technology startup without a long track record as a utility supplier. There is therefore a direct and I think underestimated link between the rise of urban inequality in cities and the promotion and take-up of smart city solutions in specific localities. Both councils in our study place digital technologies at the centre of public policy as a means to address a wider range of social and infrastructural disparities. Meanwhile, companies influenced by smart city discourses are developing technological products that address such aspirations. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the actual objects themselves that were the focus of our study. The InLink UK kiosks, or InLinks for short, which were the focus of our research in Glasgow, were a product of InLink UK, a joint venture formed in 2017 between Intersection, a US company, with minority investor Sidewalk Labs, which you may know is a subsidiary of Alphabet, Google affiliated Alphabet, and PrimeSite, a UK advertising agency in partnership with British Telecom. As of March this year, there were 487 active kiosks or InLinks deployed in a network across UK cities, all of which replaced pre-existing BT telephone booths. About a dozen of these InLink kiosks had been installed in Glasgow city centre at the time of our research. These had been deployed in June the prior year, so in 2018. The InLinks themselves offer a range of services at no cost, access to a free fast-speed Wi-Fi connection, a phone facility, 2 USB charging ports, an emergency button, and a range of mapping and directory services. So you can see in the image on the left where these services are accessed. There's a touchscreen digital tablet built into the side of the kiosk structure, a calling pad, the audio jack and 999 button. These are braille embossed, and the whole touchscreen unit is set at a height compatible for a wheelchair. Indeed, the InLink design had incorporated many accessibility features in the height and overall placement to give sufficient space for wheelchair access, the talkback hearing induction loops, the next generation text relay, and high contrast large labels. These free services are paid for by selling advertising space on the two 135 centimetre high definition digital screens, which you can see in the image on the right. The kiosks have a range of inbuilt sensors, up to 30, and 3 cameras that were not activated at the time of installation. This is important because although advertising is identified as the main revenue for the company in the short term, it was evident that, based on information, product information, and also our interviews and in the design of these models, that InLink UK has a longer term strategy to sell data generated from these sensing devices back to local councils, and we're inviting discussions with local authorities to do just that. The image here on the left is another close-up of the InLink touchscreen showing the home screen for accessing the tablet's apps, or tiles as they're called. And these provide access to the telephone and also the customizable information services, the maps, the charity helpline, the weather app, Wi-Fi registration. So this is where you sign up to use the Wi-Fi and so on. Now, I'm not going to say much more about the physicality of the inlinks, since this will be taken up by Chris later. But as a heads up, take note of the lack of inbuilt seating and placement of this kiosk on the, in the image on the right, next to an existing bench. Strawberry Energy is the company behind the smart benches we researched in London. So this company is a Serbian startup. It was set up in 2011 with an advertised mission to develop solar-powered smart urban furniture for smart and sustainable cities around the world. The company launched its first UK bench in 2015 and has since then rolled out smart benches in 30 cities across 17 countries. The benches themselves are solar powered. They provide passers-by with a free fast-speed Wi-Fi connection and several charging options. There were two models of benches that we observed, first and second generation types, with external differences only as far as we could detect. These bench units are equipped with sensors collecting real-time data on air quality, noise level, and temperature. The sensor data itself is made available to the public via a freely downloadable mobile application. So this image on the right shows the display of the sensor, the data offering itself, and it was also accessible via a web dashboard for their council partners. So in this sense, the data aspects of the kiosk were much more actively pursued and being explored by the Strawberry Energy Company, which made sense in the context that the advertising they had on the benches was primarily for sponsors, but they didn't, at least at the time of our study, sell advertising space on the benches themselves. So this here on the left is a close-up of the bench panel where you can access the USB and wireless charging facilities. You can see the council and company branding, and you can see some reference to a support number, how to sign up to the company's third-party free Wi-Fi service. You can see the bench's energy level, which, as I said, is solar powered, some instructions and reference to the terms of use, which need to be accessed, notably on the Strawberry Energy website. In both cases, the kiosks and the benches combine different aspects of street furniture, communication services, data connectivity, public information and advertising in new ways. And as with previous media innovations, these furniture designs involve what media scholars Louvreau and Livingston call recombination. So this describes the way in which media innovation processes are a continuous hybridization of both existing technologies and innovations within interconnected technical and institutional networks. So this recombination was the main source of the novelty of these new urban furniture models. So to carry out the research, just to give you a bit of background on the research methodology, we developed a qualitative mixed methods approach to examine these urban forms situated within street life, as well as within their design and governance contexts. We used a mixture of site observations, street vox pops, and semi-structured interviews, as well as document analysis of publicly available material, including privacy policies, terms of use, device specifications, press kits, and so on. We chose 3 inlinks in Glasgow's city centre and 3 strawberry benches in the borough of Southwark in South London. And the rationale behind this selection was to capture a range of urban contexts and demographic composition. And we included ones that were situated along busy walkways that were used by commuters, as well as ones sort of tucked away in side streets with shopping strips and so on. We carried out the field work between July and October, so July last year and October this year, between July and October last year, and we had 2 dedicated fieldwork teams that carried out the site observations, interviews and vox pops, one in Glasgow and one in London, made up of the researchers on the team. In total, we carried out 75 vox pops with randomly sampled passers-by and users across the six sites over 3 daily sessions, one in the morning, one at lunchtime, and one in the late afternoon. For the site observations, we conducted about 30 to 60-minute observation sessions at each of the 6 sites prior to the Vox Pops. We carried out interviews with a relatively small selection of key stakeholders, so a London-based data privacy activist, a community group in Glasgow, the CEO of the Smart Bench company, some city planners and councillors, a pre-fieldwork discussion with one representative from InLink UK. For the data analysis, we actually collaboratively coded this using NVivo. It was quite an exercise. Some of it was done in person, some of it was done virtually. The coding was done over 2 stages, and the data from the site observations and the Vox Pops provided most of the insights about how people encountered and made meaningful these objects in urban space. This was combined with the data from interviews and documents, which we then applied for further thematic analysis, finally drawing up a set of themes around smart city imaginaries and realisations, data governance and discovery processes. So just wrapping up my sort of introductory section, and I realise there's been a few quite a lot of detail provided, but I think it sets the stage for Sophia and Chris's presentations. These are the research outcomes of our project to date. We have 1 commissioned book chapter under review and 2 journal articles, both under review. We have the research report, which I will launch later. And this is the first of a series of impact workshops and events through which we hope to share the findings and engage in discussions with partners and stakeholders and members of the public. So just to let you know, the main presentations today by Sophia and Chris are based on the 2 publications that I have highlighted, the book chapter and the journal article in Environment and Planning, and doesn't go into a great amount of detail into the data governance aspects of these the smart street furniture under investigation. So this will be published, this aspect is in the research report, but it will also be published in the Journal of Urban Technology. So I'm now going to hand over to Sophia, who's going to talk to us about Imaginaries of Smart.
Thanks, Justine, and thanks everyone for hosting me over in Mexico. So I'll be talking to you about Imaginaries, and we're talking about Imaginaries because they relate to our broader project goals of understanding who the smart city is for and who uses it. So designers are anticipating particular kinds of publics within smart city context. And so by looking at the way the connections and the disconnect between some of the, I guess, imaginaries in terms of the design and the provider scale and how they're actually used in practice can give us some interesting insights into smart city, including who is it for and who is using it and how we can be more inclusive. So smart city imaginaries is frequently framed as an efficient and a connected city, and it's also a city for smart citizens. It's underpinned by smart and connected infrastructure. So your city services, including transport and also the provision of street furniture, they're all connected and Wi-Fi enabled and embedded with sensors. The smart citizen comes into being by being enabled by this connectivity. As critics note, however, the imagined smart public lacks inclusivity, and the emergence and operation of the smart city is rarely seamless. So there's already a sort of this sense that there's a discrepancy between what is sort of promoted and what is the actual lived reality. Next slide, Justine, thanks. So within the smart cities, when citizens are talked about, just a little bit of background, the earlier versions of smart cities, any discussions around citizens were notably absent because the focus was on technology. Reflecting on this, there seemed to be a trend to the citizen as being enabled by technology. So citizens have either been framed as either active or passive in relation to smart city technology, but critically, data, both its generation and analysis, underpins both versions or both types of citizen. Next slide, please. Thanks. So to talk about active citizens, the framings of active citizenship references users who purposely generate their own data or make use of city data. So when we talk about open data initiatives, crowdsourcing of data, and sometimes events like hackathons, we see the ideal of the smart citizen being portrayed through these as actively participating and problem solving in the urban. The extent to which these practices actually reflect citizen agency is open to critique. Sunye Pern notes that they actually encourage entrepreneurial citizenship and civic paternalism, with what's being engineered tending to be neoliberal citizenship. However, they do have the potential to engage citizens in shaping urban futures by being able to disrupt neoliberal cooptation, repurposing state and privatized resources, and building civic infrastructure. So next slide, please. So next is the passive citizen. Passive smart citizenship also relies on data. Unlike the user-generated data of active participation, though, the data is often unconsciously generated by an individual's everyday digital footprint as they interact and move through the urban space. So a citizen profile begins to build through, for example, the use of the smart transport card, free Wi-Fi connections, electronic purchases, and geolocation services. So they're still generating data, but they're either ambivalent, not on purpose, it's sort of ambivalence, or just comes with their actions, or they're unaware of it. Next slide, please. So regardless of whether a citizen is active or passive, move to make, to bring the citizen back into the smart city discourse still remains grounded in a pragmatic, instrumental, and paternalistic discourse and practice, rather than those of social rights, political citizenship, and the common good. And next slide, please. So what does smart street furniture tell us about the smart citizen? Well, it's a really interesting way to look at who it's been imagined for and who uses it as part of their citizen within the smart city. We've come across three main ways from the actual corporate material and designs and promo packages, that they're for young, mobile and connected users. Both the citizens and the infrastructure is concerned with being smart and sustainable, and that the infrastructure is essential, but it's a little bit murky for whom it's essential for. So to start with the young, mobile and connected users, next slide, please. Both InLink and UK and Strawberry Energy prioritise improving the connectivity of cities and citizens in the design and promotional material of their furniture. Potential end users of their products are represented as young, mobile and connected. They're pictured engaging with kiosks and benches remotely using their smartphones by connecting to the Wi-Fi, and directly by making use of inbuilt facilities to sustain their existing connectivity. Benches themselves, the smart benches themselves, are presented as places of informal socialization, which are enhanced by access to Wi-Fi and charging facilities, and described as providing energy, connectivity, and relevant local information on the go. So that's our active user. We find, sorry, I think I'm a slide behind, sorry. No, sorry, where am I up to? So this is our active user, and then our other user is, I guess, well, that's how it appears in the material. Then we move on to the smart and sustainable, which is environmental sustainability, also figuring in the marketing of this furniture. So Strawberry Energy describes its mission as developing solar-powered smart urban furniture for smart and sustainable cities. And it locates its infrastructures and potential end users with people-centric smart city discourses and emerging ideas of smart citizenship. So their users can use the Strawberry app, which allows them to connect to the smart bench network while they're moving through the city, and to share sharing local information collected from the benches sensors on social media platforms and websites. So these are smart citizens who are actively engaging with smart technologies in urban environments and generating data in real time, which is allegedly used to improve public spaces and the company's services. But a complicating feature of these imaginaries is that despite the absence of marginalized users represented in promotional material, the design of the kiosks and benches includes features and services that are suggestive of a less connected public user. The kiosks in particular have, in addition to their free Wi-Fi and charging facilities, the added features of an emergency call button, free telephone service, and a social services directory accessible through the inbuilt touchscreen tablet. Commercial providers recognise the ongoing value and business case for extending connectivity in the context of an infrastructural gap, and they use this to support their business case. But at the same time, the public user imaginary is actually, this particular one is under-articulated without a clear sense of whom or for why these are vital. So in our analysis, we found, compared to, I guess, what we see in the marketing material, in the actual use, a much more diverse range of actors. So we have the active user, which we'll get into later, who is present, but not in the way that was envisioned by the material. The passive user, and we come across another type, which is the other user, imagined by other members of the public. So there's a big disconnect between the images of the young urban mobile and connected users and the actual users that we observe using the furniture. Okay, so next slide, please. Sorry. So the passive user is someone who is not very aware or really concerned with the material, with the infrastructure. And that was actually a lot of the people that we talked to. So they'd sort of been aware of it, but we're not really sure what it was for. And they conform to this idea that a lack of the passive user, characterized by a lack of use of these objects and a certain indifference to their existence. So at the first part, I'm not really paying attention for them. They're not new, but I'm pretty much indifferent. The other aspect of this is that they may or may not be aware that they're actually using them. So this particular respondent here down the bottom has at one point logged into the data services, but is not particularly aware of whether they're connected or not as they're walking by. So pretty ambivalent, and their connection can be automated instead of intentional. Next slide, please. The other passive user is in terms of the advertising and consumption of advertisements. So the InLinks UK network is funded through advertising on the device's screens. And as highlighted by this quote here, that's actually what a lot of people thought it was for, just an advertising screen. And they hadn't actually noticed the interactive service available. So these users didn't discover the kiosks and benches through a need, but had the potential to become more intentional active users. But nevertheless, seemingly passive users still generated data and were also an important audience for the city and the advertisers, marketing, and third parties. Next slide, please. The active users now, So unsurprisingly, an active user intentionally interacts with the kiosk or bench. However, unlike the urban professionals envisioned by the vendors, our observations show that these users, particularly for the kiosks, are predominantly those with insecure access to the internet and telecommunications. The two main groups of active users were the homeless and gig economy workers. We frequently observe people who seemed homeless using the free call function of the InLinks. The inclusion of a free phone service in the kiosk design is a distinctive aspect of the InLinks and had an important part of its business case to local councils. This function allows callers to connect to any number within the UK and can help those without other forms of communication to maintain contact and connect with services. It was a vital facility for those members of the public who were without a working mobile phone, but there were drawbacks. as we can see here in this quote, or this excerpt from our field notebooks, our observations showed that the kiosks weren't always reliable, and calls were sometimes failing to connect, callbacks could not be received, which limited the utility of the phone service, and the open design of the kiosk, unlike a traditional phone booth, meant that callers had to speak loudly to be heard, and lean into the kiosk to hear the phone conversation. And this particular one, this particular user couldn't get the phone to work and got very frustrated with it. Next one, please. So our other active user commonly observed were gig workers. They were regularly observed using the kiosk to charge their phones and connect to the Wi-Fi. And the services offered by their inlinks were valuable to them, enabling them to do their work by being able to charge their handsets and connect with them while waiting for jobs. So we can see with this participant here, had forgotten their phone. They take their charger with them most of the time, but they forgot it today. So they back it up at the inlinks, and it's useful in that sense for charging on the go. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, something's just gone wrong with my computer. Okay, so in terms of the active user of the benches and then the kiosks, they're not the ones we expect to see from the marketing material, although there were among the user groups observed. While active users are imagined as those who interact with data services, the benches were by and large used as traditional benches rather than for their smart functions. So benches were actually used to, unsurprisingly, I guess, sit upon. However, with some of the functions that we've seen, there were a number of barriers to use. So the active user imaginary is dependent not only on alignment with the actual user, but also the usability of the devices and their data generating features. So whether they were functional or whether the person had the capacity to connect. Okay, next slide, please. So then we come to what we decided to call the imagined other user. So this other user is imagined by the public. They're frequently referred to in relation to an individual's use or non-use of the furniture. For example, why someone might say that they've no need to use the features of the kiosk or bench themselves, they envision it being useful for others. These others are predominantly those who need the connectivity affordances of the infrastructure. So common examples were the homeless, tourists, and students. So for example, here, my first thought was it was for the homeless who need to have access to being able to call resources, and it's great. Again, the second quote identifies homeless people using it, and both very positive, I guess, reflections on its use there. And next slide, please. These observations highlight the benefits of the infrastructure, but also positioned it as something that other people with less resources than themselves use. The provision of connectivity, information, data, and free calls was seen as positive. But it also points to the existence of a larger public that is smart, so a larger smart public, than that envisioned by the smart furniture vendors of cities. One that's more inclusive in the way that the smart citizen inhabits public space and the public sphere. Next slide, please. So what are the actual differences between the imagined and the actual users? So when we look at active users, while there are similarities between some of these characteristics and those of the design imaginaries, namely mobility, urban-based and connectivity, there are also disconnects. Rather than young urban professionals, these active smart citizens are those who inhabit more precarious positions within the urban. They're the gig workers and the homeless, citizens who are predominantly absent from the design and technology provider material, and who are rarely discussed as citizens in broader smart city literature and also strategy documents. Next, please. The passive user is actually more likely to be the young urban connected mobile professional. but they don't use, but because they're able to be mobile and connected through their own data plans, they don't actually use the connectivity of the kiosks and the benches in the way that was envisioned. They predominantly have the privilege of their own phones and data, meaning that they need less to rely on the free services offered by the furniture. They may automatically connect to Wi-Fi as they move through the city, having previously signed up to the service provider, but they don't actively seek out the connectivity. At the same time, passive users have the potential to become active users and have a more complex relation to advertising data and data consumption than suggested in the corporate held public imaginaries. Next slide, please. And our third imagined other user is interesting in that it provides insight into the smart citizen from the perspective of the actually existing publics. The public's imagined other user offers interesting critique of the users imagined by the design and technology providers, as well as local government. The absence of homeless and less affluent users from discourses and designs surrounding the furniture described here highlights that exclusion exists in the imagined smart city as well. But the public's vision of the imagined other user, based on their own observations and reflections of the use of kiosks and benches, shows that a more inclusive vision of the smart citizen can emerge. And next slide, please. So smart street infrastructure with these three types of, I guess, of publics that we've described here can serve a diverse publics dependent on their needs and also the refashioning of the public and public space. Reliance on the connectivity afforded by the furniture varies dependent on a user's own access to mobile technology, data, and mobility. Those who have their own phones and data plans, predominantly those young urban professionals, need and use the furniture less than those who are not as materially resourced and mobile. And the use of the furniture by those who do not have as much access to connectivity points to some important areas for social justice and inclusion to be further incorporated in designs and discourses around the smart city. And that's my section. So over to you, Chris.
Great, thank you very much. Nice to see everybody here. And my background is in Glasgow, where we did some of the field work. What I'm going to be talking about today is the article that we've submitted to Environment and Planning C, Early Encounters and Negotiations with Smart Street Furniture in London and Glasgow, but we always knew it as the paper on discovering smart. Next slide, please. Yeah. There are actually multiple moments of discovery, so different worlds in which the artifact did not exist, that it came into existence. So the manufacturers themselves identified the kind of demand for smart city technologies and identified a kind of changing media environment particularly with the emergence of mobile media. And so they designed artifacts that fit into this world. The councils were also informed, as Justine pointed out before, by the and Sophia, by the discourses of the smart city, partly to do with a desire for efficiency and partly to do with a desire for new, dynamic, economically beneficial and environmentally sensitive services. Then finally, the last group of people that discover these artifacts are publics themselves. Unlike, say, consumer objects, which are advertised and purchased, these are available for free, but may or may not be taken up by actual people. Next slide, please. So we, for this paper, I guess, wanted to draw on three classic traditions in discoverability or in technological discovery. First of all, there's Don Norman's work in design and psychology on discoverability and affordances. Second, there's the more social analysis of Everett Rogers about the way that an innovation diffuses through society. And thirdly, there's the social construction of technology, which is sort of an early science and technology studies concept that argues that technologies don't really exist until they're made meaningful and useful by particular users and social groups. Next slide. So going into this a little bit more, Don Norman emphasizes the question of the affordance, which is the way in which action, the possibilities for action are perceived by users. And it takes place in the encounter between the artifact and the psychology of the user, and the way in which the utility of the object becomes discoverable. Part of that is defined by the physical, cultural, semantic, logical, and natural constraints that impose action. So, for example, the touch screen communicates something that is a knowledge in the head of the user about how to, because the touch screen is now culturally familiar enough that it's understandable that you should be touching that screen. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, the idea of touching a screen was quite foreign. So people are aware of the constraints. And there's this interface between the knowledge in the head and the knowledge in the world. And we found that there's a sort of disjunction, because particularly with the inlinks, that people may have known what Wi-Fi and touch screens were, but they didn't necessarily make the connection to the object in the world. Next slide, please. The second theorist that we drew upon was Everett Rogers. And you can see that Rogers has this classic and very influential graph of the innovators who started first, which are relatively few people, the early adopters who take up the technology and enthusiastically communicate it to the early majority, and so on. And then there's laggards behind. Now, there are problems with this construction that we're aware of, but you can see that there's the three different arcs of discovery from the innovators themselves through the council and the champions within the council for that technology or the artifact. And then among the public, we found that in the stories that people told about their adoption of these technologies, that some said that they only really noticed it when they watched other people using devices. So that's where there's a kind of just a social process of discovery. Next slide, please. And then the social construction of technology tradition. I guess this became meaningful for us because a large number of people were not actually making active use. And so it became, as Sophia was talking about, it became most meaningful and useful for particular groups like homeless people and gig workers. Another concept in social construction of technology is the idea of variation and selection. So we can see that the inlink is not an entirely new artifact, but it's a variation upon the phone booth with the changed environment and configurations. And similarly, the smart bench is a variation on the traditional bench, but also on the portable, on the home charger, and on Wi-Fi service. Next slide, please. So here's a lot of text, which is basically the Strawberry Energies discovery narrative. So where they told us about the motivation in the design process and who they saw were the key stakeholders that their bench was offering to local government for cheap infrastructure, for people for free services, and for local brands for whom it was a promotional opportunity. The value of environmental sustainability was quite important, the sort of symbolic value. But it also meant that the devices were movable and self-sustained, whereas the inlinks needed to be installed and fixed. The smart benches were actually portable, and this actually mattered in the licensing process, which I'll come to in a moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there were two approval processes for smart street furniture. the inlinks had to go through a full planning process. So the council committee would evaluate where each of these devices should be installed. Because it was permanent, it had to they had to account for the possible hazards of its use and so on. Now, on the other hand, the strawberry benches only needed approval from a licensing manager in the council, because they were considered to be temporary fixtures for a period of 5 years. So even though on the street, you'd come across these artifacts, the fact that it was self-contained and solar powered meant that it didn't have to go through the ordinary planning process. So this is the interview with the person from Southwark Transport and Roads, who said, yeah, they gave us a big list of locations. We sort of looked through those lists to see, is it in a conservation area? No. Is it somewhere busy so that it doesn't get vandalized or doesn't attract people to do crimes? But it was a very much informal process. Next slide. And so it left the councillor, one of the councillors that we interviewed, dealing with the problems with benches that such as noise and even drug dealing. This person said the majority hate them, but tourists love them. And they described what the resident had said. They were having picnics, they were having parties, they were making phone calls, they were charging the telephone at all hours of the night. And it continued and developed into actual drug dealing. So as a result of that negotiation, the bench was moved to a different location. Next slide, please. Yeah, so of the people that we spoke to at the benches, 35 of the 45 had noticed them before, but only 19 had actually used the smart features. And when we told people that, hey, these benches are smart, people sort of came up with quite imaginative ideas about what it might actually be for. They said maybe it monitors your heartbeat and sees if you're going to have a heart attack. So I think there are sort of expansive imagination about what smart street furniture might be. Next slide. This is what InLink put out when they released the links for the first time. So they emphasized a lot of figures, 100,000 subscribers, 12 InLinks, ultra fast Wi-Fi speeds of 1 gigabit per second. And it really was the fastest Wi-Fi that I've ever used, to tell you the truth. Free phone calls. So these are all the values that the InLink people wanted people to discover. So what actually happened? Next slide. Now, the InLinks themselves this is sort of bringing in the Don Norman concepts. They have a degree of poor discoverability because people don't know what they are. There's not enough knowledge in the world. They don't look like phone booths. And so people, they don't have a handset. And so people might have a knowledge in their head, but that doesn't align with knowledge in the world. Next, please. They lack shelter. So whereas a phone booth, you would be sheltered from the weather, you would you'll be contained in the booth and have the sound buffered for you. And you'd also have a private space, whereas the InLinks had quite a loud speaker that people around you could hear or can hear. It also has intrusive advertising. So even though they make a big deal about that it's very thin in design, in fact, it's a very wide object with intrusive advertising and potential for surveillance. As Justine pointed out, it's got 3 cameras and the possibility of Wi-Fi surveillance. So these are things that are affordances that are not available in the phone booth. Next. But of course, it does have very high-speed broadband, which is useful in a context of mobile media connectivity. Next. And it has the free phone calls for people who don't have access to the telephone. So it is particularly those people who are carrying around a lot of change trying to make phone calls for whom this is of great value. Next slide. So of the 30 people that we interviewed in Glasgow, 25 didn't really understand the features of it. So we asked them questions. What do you think it might be? Have you got any ideas? Nope, no idea. Nope. Next. And so we found that we actually kind of participated in Everett Rogers' sort of social process of diffusion, where we asked people, you know, what do you think? Is it to do with Wi-Fi? They said, oh yeah, there, it's got that sign up there. Do you know how to use them? No. Okay, looking at it, what do you think the features are? It's advertising. Maybe it'll give you a light so you can see your watch at night. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. And obviously there's the phone looks pretty easy to use. So we actually encountered and mediated a discovery process. So people could actually make sense of these devices if they were prompted, but it had been just part of, disappeared into the urban landscape for them before that. Next slide. And we can also talk about a social construction process of the inlinks. We did observe a homeless person pulling a milk crate up to sit next to the inlink, because one of the problems with the links is that if you want to plug in your charger, there's nowhere to sit. That's the beauty of the benches. At least you can plug your phone into the charger and sit. One of the interesting things about the benches is traditionally benches have been a place to sit and to gaze out upon the world. But the majority of people that we observed using the benches would use the bench to sit and use their phone, either making a call or browsing their phone. So the uses of benches, I think, has actually changed in the past 20 years. But people who then bring a milk crate to compensate for the absence of the seat. Link NYC actually had on the touch screen a web browser enabled, but the story was that people were leaving porn sites on it. And so part of the social construction is hobbling the technology so that perceived problem uses would be restricted, or also playing music. So there's sort of expectations or norms of behavior that were configured into the way that the devices were installed and configured. And another example is call blocking to stop criminals making phone calls. So people were using the phone to organize drug deals. And so they instituted call blocking. Another example of the particular use is as a meeting place for gig workers, where one person rode up on a bike, stood next to the inlink, plugged in their phone, and a few minutes later, one of their mates came up and so they used it as a meeting place, a way in which the artifact takes on a particular usage, not necessarily directly anticipated by the designers. And now I'll throw to Justine for a wind up. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you also, Sophia. They were both fantastic presentations. And I want to make sure that we've got time for questions. So I would like to just quickly summarise a few key points that have come out of both of those presentations. The first one is really that I think these initiatives prove to be largely experimental, and there's a really big question facing these companies and also local governments entering into these sorts of engagements about the long-term feasibility of the economic model based on advertising or monetization of real-time data, which is yet to be proven successful. And this is starkly illustrated by the collapse of the InLink UK joint venture shortly after our fieldwork. But it's also evident in the rapid changeover of key sponsors and partners in the Strawberry Energy venture. Second, I think what we need to think about here is that these innovations rely on buy-in from councils that are willing to take risks in public spaces. And there does seem to be a connection between councils with bigger infrastructural divides taking such risks compared to wealthier ones whose constituents have more access to private resources. So another big question here is this risk something that can be sustained? How else might the uneven distribution of resources and infrastructures in cities be addressed? Another point here is that, as Sophia pointed out, smart citizens are more diverse in their makeup than they're currently being designed for. And I think that came out really strongly in Chris's paper as well. What can we learn from this in terms of recognizing how these objects can be designed differently to better meet the needs of their actual users and take into account some of those, quite imaginative ideas about what these objects could potentially do in public space. And related to this point is that data relations are, much more complex than we might initially think about, and that the sort of agencies of users are much more complex than just sort of being active or passive. And they're very much dependent on the kinds of knowledges and access to resources that individual members of the public have. So as Chris's presentation highlighted, user adoption can't be taken for granted, and that discovery processes are key for understanding the the future prospects of smart street furniture. And actually we have already a very sophisticated set of theoretical tools for evaluating this discovery process and learning from this. And finally, I just wanted to conclude on the inclusion dimension, which I think comes across really strongly in this study. And that is that for most people with sufficient mobile data plans, these services aren't really crucial. However, they are a lifeline for the people that payphones used to use and still do serve, and those most impacted by austerity and the shrinking of social services. So when we're thinking about the future of smart street furniture, it's critical that we understand this broader context and that we also connect smart innovation to goals of making cities and local governments not only more livable, but also more equal places. So on that note, I'd like to launch the research report and thank Sophia and Chris again, and just let you know that this is available for download as a PDF from the Smart Publics website. Very keen to talk to anybody who wishes to follow up on this presentation. But on this note, I would like to hand over to the audience for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, I have one for all of you just to get us started. So you've given us a very comprehensive overview of the project so far and your initial findings. I'm a little bit familiar with Chris and Justine's research, but to all of you, and I'd be very interested to hear Sophia as well, what directions do you have in mind for the future of building on this project, either collectively or individually? Because there's so much in there, and I imagine that each of you are interested in different aspects of pushing the project further. So I'd be interested to hear of any future directions for each of you, individually or collectively.
Yeah, well, I guess Justine and I are involved in a project on robots in public space, which is sort of a natural evolution from this work and my previous work on robotics. And Justine and I have also written stuff on the voice of the robot. So robots are even less common than smart street furniture, but they are becoming a range of different sort of genres or robot types, like security robots, guide robots, and porter robots that carry things. So there's a variety of different ways in which there's even a robot in Gregory Hill's Woolworths that moves through the aisles and spots spillages. So we're interested, and then alerts people, hey, sets off an alarm to tell the staff that they have to clean up the spillage. And the reaction to that robot has been pretty mixed. People aren't sure that it's actually very superior to the other ways in which it might solve the same problem. So with many of these robotics, there's sort of solutions in search of problems. But yeah, that's the next step in our research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I thanks, Chris. I think you've raised some really interesting connections there, and also research directions that are quite closely connected to this project, particularly in terms of the way in which new kinds of I guess objects with wheels, objects that fly, objects that that sort of have other ways of moving about in public space are increasingly finding their ways into cities, particularly, but and also other kinds of places that we live in, and that there's sort of a range of different research questions that come up with that sort of shift to mobility, moving objects, which is quite different to sort of stationary objects that still have some sort of we might still have some familiarity with, as you pointed out, that there is some knowledge in the world, even if it's not complete in terms of how these objects work. But I think mobile robots are another thing altogether. And then I think some of the other research directions here is trying to understand what's happening in an Australian context, and how developments in Australia are or are not being influenced by these sorts of smart innovations or urban innovations in other cities, in other contexts. Of course, COVID puts a huge spoke in the works in terms of what all of this means for public space and our interactions in public space, and whether we need to be thinking about incorporating and designing for public space in a completely different way. I think it was Matthew Louis, actually, who is here today, who is on the Partnership Awards committee in the organisation of the Office of Global Engagement, and asked the very pertinent question of how did you feel about touching the touchscreens? And this was during the early stages of this year. And of course, at the time, it didn't really bother me at all, except for the fact that they looked a bit grimy. And maybe I thought, maybe I should wash my hands afterwards, but it was sort of a second thought. But of course, now I don't know if I would touch the touch screens, particularly with sort of the evidence around how long COVID lasts on hard surfaces. So, I think that there are all sorts of new questions that we need to think about in terms of how we interact, but also what kinds of media and urban forms we're designing for the future in cities that can be flexible enough to deal with these sorts of situations.
And I think for me, so a lot of my background is around smart cities and dashboards, and also the policy and the planning, I guess, angles on that. And so I feel, following on from Justine's comments there, as well as Chris's, the Australian context is going to be very interesting, because our governance scheme as well, like our hierarchical 3-tiered levels of government, it's a different context to overseas, in where a lot of these have been rolled out before. And also the size of our country versus the density puts some really interesting question marks in terms of return on investment for some of these, I guess, these infrastructures. There are a few trial ones, like smart benches happening. They're on campus at the moment, which is more about the battery than the actual feature. So these things are, popping up. But how it actually rolls out, I think, is something that we still need to see. And if anyone has seen the ones on campus, I've been with a few colleagues, and everyone's very what are these? What do they do? Where is it that, you know, the actual discovery process, similar to what Chris was talking about, is really interesting. And whether you want to actually use it. So I know Justine's work in particular is also very focused on social justice questions and the homeless. And we can see from our research that, you know, they're quite, you know, key services provided for homeless populations through these infrastructures. But we know from existing sort of public space design interventions that a lot of it's purposely designed to keep homeless people moving and out of public space. So where is the sort of intersection going to sit here? Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Matthew Louis. How were the intended use of drug deals identified so calls could be blocked?
Question.
Actually, my understanding of that is that there was some machine learning tools that were actually used for that particular purpose, and it was based on pattern recognition of calls from specific in-link kiosks in London, and that you know, that the pattern recognition indicated certain numbers that were being redialed over and over again in certain areas. And some machine learning software was also applied to try and boost sort of insights into what could be concluded from those patterns, from those call patterns. And that was the basis of the call, or the initiative to introduce that call blocking technology, which was then based on those that pattern being detected by the device.
Chris or Sophia? Or
oh no,
okay,
just algorithmic machine learning. Yeah.
Yep. Jamala says, thanks to Justine, Chris and Sophia for this very interesting presentation. Something that came onto my mind, do you think that the design of those smart benches, smart furniture failed to advertise themselves in terms of making people aware of what their functions are?
Yeah, I think they certainly make an effort. So there is signage kind of all over them. But I think there's just people get used to what the affordances in their city, and they don't necessarily recognize when something new comes along. And also, I think that the urgent need with, although, you know, one of the innovative features of smartphones was a much shorter battery life, still the battery life is sort of now at a tolerable level for the majority of people. So that's not a huge issue. With mobile phone plans, a lot of people have unlimited data now. So maybe some of these, and with free phone calls, sure, you know, that's great. But these things would have been really attractive 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, to the point where people might have noticed them. But there's not an urgent need that these devices are really serving for the majority of people.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we also looked carefully at the signage, and you know, what we did notice is that there is, you know, not considerable absence of signage, you could say, in both cases, but particularly with the inlinks, because really the main, I guess, point of attention that the companies are trying to, that the inlink itself is trying to draw the public's attention to, are the screens, rather than signage around it. So the signage was quite minimal and very, very subtle. And unless you are driven by need, you know, if you don't have access to a telephone or to a mobile phone that works, or to a to the internet, unless you're driven by need, then it is very easy to kind of miss the signage. And in fact, in New York City, one of the things that Intersection, the supplier of the kiosk, did at the launch of the initial launch of their network was to hire volunteer ambassadors. They called them link ambassadors, who stood next to the kiosks and sort of introduced the object to the public, a little bit like our role as researchers. So that was quite interesting.
It was quite interesting. I hadn't sort of seen the functionality or the design. Well, I'd seen sort of a broad design, but of the inlinks before we got to Glasgow, and Justine was a lot more familiar with them. So we tried, me as an experiment, trying to find and locate and use it, which was particularly entertaining because we chose a broken one. But it wasn't particularly intuitive either once you got to the screen. So I think there's you know, some issues there as well, beyond the free call button. Yeah.
Yeah, but people did have to ask, oh, it's got free calls, does it?
Yeah.
You know, it's not familiar.
Yeah.
Chow Sun asks, are there any terms and conditions the user needs to agree to before using the device? Users may not know and understand the company can run pattern recognition on the numbers being called.
That's a really good point. There definitely are terms and conditions that were available on the InLink UK website, which is no longer available. So we did archive the website prior to the website being taken down, but when the joint venture collapsed and British Telecom took over the operations of the kiosks, the website was removed. So, which raises a really interesting question, which is how you access the terms and conditions of the InLinks now. And I'm not sure whether or not the public has access to those terms and conditions via a website. But I don't think that those, I have read through those terms and conditions, and I'm not familiar with I don't remember whether it had pattern recognition in it or not, because that was a that was a feature that was introduced relatively recently. I don't think it included it from memory, but I'd have to double check. It did talk about how the data was shared, but I don't think it specifically referred to pattern recognition.
Yeah, I think when you logged onto Wi-Fi, you got some information, and you could either log in securely to Wi-Fi, or you could wing it. And I tried doing the login securely, but it was too hard, so I just went with the direct unsubscribing one.
All of the issues around the data are actually quite carefully detailed in the paper that has been submitted to the Journal of Urban Technology, which is so I would, you know, if you're interested, I'd be happy to, once that's published, send through links to anybody who's interested in finding out more about those, because actually there's a lot of, it's quite complex, because there's a lot of different data elements and data generating points. And as Sophia pointed out, even at the user, from the user end, those data points are quite, you know, quite complex, let alone from the end of the device itself, which is essentially a box that contains data generating devices.
Matt Gardner asks, there were some new gallium-powered benches installed on campus. Did you have any involvement with those?
No, we haven't, but these are the benches that Sophia just talked about. I think she's already tested them. She's been out in the field.
Yeah. Look, they, yeah, we haven't had any involvement in them. And as far as they go in terms of the smart functionalities that we've been talking about, there's none of that on there. I think these are testing the batteries and seeing how they'll go before any sort of added functionality.
They're for lighting. They're for lighting, aren't they? They're for lighting.
They're lighting, yeah.
I think so, yeah.
And solar powered. It's to test the battery more than, there's no Wi-Fi that I could find, or charging points or anything like that. A few colleagues were hoping that it would automatically mark their assignments for them. But finding out that it didn't, they didn't think it was that smart. So yeah. But no, that's run from chemistry.
Yeah, it's a kind of a showcase, isn't it, or a test bed.
But I guess just sort of picking up on the point of the Galilean-powered benches, or any other, I guess, set of series of urban objects that are rolled out with, even if they're sort of with limited functionality, what is, I think, really significant about these is that they can operate as a network. And so that it's really a shift in paradigm, both architecturally and technologically, in terms of how we think about urban, objects in urban space, and their relationship to data, because they operate at that network level as well as standalone devices in specific places.
And which sort of builds into some of the ideas around the smart city as more of the network city than just the smart city. So this idea that, and that comes into the citizen, I guess, literature, that you can continue to be connected as you work your way through the city.
I might ask a question.
Go ahead, Agatha.
This is actually on behalf of Michael Ward, who was on, and then because he was on his phone, it's dropped, but he's kind of passed on a question on his behalf. He wants to know if we know of any plans to, or any councils in Australia, or any plans to install these kinds of benches. Is that something that's being looked into, that we know of and that we're getting involved in?
Well, yes. I mean, as Sophia and I mentioned before, what's happening, we're sort of on the cusp in Australia of really starting to see some of these objects in public spaces. We're not quite there yet. The City of Sydney recently licensed QMS, which is a new supplier of all of their street furniture, to supply a whole range of different kinds of objects to replace their current bus stops and benches and so on throughout the City of Sydney. I don't know when we're going to see those, but that they have signed a contract and they've got a license, I think, for the next certain number of years. A little bit like the license that the City of New York had with Intersection to implement and manage the street furniture over a period of time. And that displaces some of the existing public-private partnerships that are currently in place in the City of Sydney with JCDecaux that had a very long-standing license for the City of Sydney. We also know that Telstra has been doing some development on their payphone network, and that those are likely to be updated, upgraded, or replaced with new versions over the, very soon, over the coming years. They've met with some legal barriers, and both City of Sydney and Melbourne councils took them to the federal court, and that case is still, it was originally decided in Telstra's favour, and I think there's now an appeal in process. So, I think that there are some obstacles that, or I wouldn't necessarily call them obstacles. There's a process of negotiation and development going on in Australia, which means that we haven't actually seen large-scale implementations of these, but we definitely will. There are definitely small-scale ones. The chill-out hubs at St George's River Council is a really good example, and that was a collaboration between Street Furniture Australia, University of New South Wales, and St George's River Council. And I'm actually quite excited about those because they have a particular sort of Australian design characteristics. There's like a barbecue and a stand-up desk in a park under a tree, and a kind of a tree-looking structure. So yeah, these are kind of, they're definitely being sort of developed. We just haven't necessarily, they haven't necessarily reached all of the streets yet. And it will be a very uneven process of distribution as well.
I've got a follow-up question of my own then to that, which is, given the pandemic, and these are very high touch surfaces in order to be using them in very public places, do you have any thoughts on how perhaps that might affect the rollout of these in the future?
I mean, I think the pandemic has sort of shifted a lot of things, but the smart furniture doesn't have to be touch either. Like, you don't necessarily, it can be a sensor on a seat that will, like some of the smart benches, that'll, you know, tell you how many people are sitting there for how long, that kind of thing. But I do think the idea of using public regularly touch things is kind of not as popular as it once was at the moment. And so maybe, I'm not sure whether it would, say like with the Georges Rivers Council, it's a pilot program that they're running out. So at the small scale, I think it's still just piloting, but perhaps with the larger implementations that Justine was talking about, it might impact that. I don't know, that's just my guess based on not much public health knowledge.
Yeah, I think I'd be looking at into like ATMs to find out what's kind of happening in that space, to understand the sort of long-term impact of the pandemic on people's, you know, practices around using touchscreen interfaces in public spaces. But you know, I think there's already kind of there was certain sorts of concerns and anxieties that a lot of members of the public had about those touchscreen interfaces already, using them in public. But this certainly, you know, the pandemic certainly magnifies those a great deal, and makes it, you know, a very real risk. So I'm not quite sure what will happen with those in the future, except that, you know, we're seeing really interesting adaptations in public space. So, you know, and in shops and shopping centres with the provision of hand sanitizers. I've seen some people kind of, I don't know if you've seen this, but I saw in my local area, someone blue tacking a hand sanitizer next to our local ATM. I thought it was a fantastic idea.
So we'll leave it there for the afternoon, but do please check our upcoming events, which I have just put in the chat. So before we log off, everyone just can open that window and have a look at the 3 remaining events for the semester. And I look forward to downloading the report. The findings in it must be absolutely fascinating, and the research that's gone into it, and it's such a pivotal moment as well, is absolutely promising. So I'm just going to put a last applause on to say thank you so much to all of our speakers.
I think that applause should be for our audience, because you know, it's a real commitment coming into Zoom land for an hour and a half on a Thursday. So yeah. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and for you know, for listening to the speakers. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to thank Justine and Chris for driving this partnership, basically. So yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a terrific partnership, working with Glasgow, Sydney University, across with architecture, design and planning. I really think that the Partnership Collaboration Awards are a fantastic initiative within the university, and I'd encourage any other researchers to think about applying if they have future rounds, because it is a very good way to, you know, it's a very compressed time span, 12 months to do such a big, it's actually quite a small scale project, but spread across 2 countries and 2 cities. But I would, you know, recommend considering it, and like to thank Matthew Louis and everyone else at the Office of Global Engagement, who actually gave a lot of really valuable support throughout the project.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it was a really great experience to work with such a great team of scholars. We actually, they came out to Australia and we went over there. So it was a really good intensive workshop time that we spent. So it was a really productive experience.
Excellent. Well, we'll call it an afternoon. So thank you everyone for sitting in once again, and have a great week. And we look forward to seeing you at the next seminar.
Thank you very much, Jelena.
Thanks.
Wonderful hostess.